Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The settlement sat quiet in the late afternoon. A dry wind carried dust along the main street, settling into the cracks of false front buildings and across the hitching posts where two tired horses shifted their weight. The place wasn't large. One saloon, a store, a sheriff's office, a few houses on the edge. Beyond them stretched miles of pale grassland broken only by ridges of rock. It wasn't a place where strangers were welcomed, least of all those who carried the features of the people the settlers had pushed aside. Nayeli came walking in from the flats, her steps slow but deliberate. She was 23 now, though her face bore lines of hardship that made her seem older. Her dress, torn along the shoulder and hip, still carried the dried brown of blood where a wound had half healed. Hunger had narrowed her frame, but her back stayed straight. Each step into town was weighed with risk. She knew well enough how settlers looked at Apache women, like trouble, like reminders of raids and losses. She had avoided them for years, but her strength was nearly gone, and she had reached the edge of survival. To move forward was dangerous. To turn back meant dying alone. She told herself that walking into this settlement was not surrender, but choice, her last choice to keep living. Her heart pounded harder the closer she came to the yard that sat on the outskirts, a small corral patched with mismatched boards. She knew this place. Once, years ago, before soldiers and settlers scattered her people, she had played here as a girl. She remembered a boy who had shared bread with her, who had sat with her by the creek without fear or shame. The memory had stayed through the years like a stone in her pocket, something small but grounding. She didn't know if he would even remember her now, or if time and bitterness had buried those days. Still, her feet carried her forward until she reached the gate. Elias Carver was working by the corral when he saw her. He had a hammer in one hand, a bent nail held between his teeth, and a sweat-stained shirt that clung to his shoulders. 30 years old, weathered by long seasons of drifting, Elias had the look of a man who had carried burdens he never spoke of. His past was heavy with mistakes and silences. A brother dead in Kansas, a ranch job lost after a drunken brawl, too many years spent on trails where no one knew his name. He had come here 2 years ago to live quieter, repairing fences, raising a few head of cattle, and staying away from the noise of town. People said he preferred his own company, and that was mostly true. Keeping distance was easier than losing again. When he first noticed the figure by the gate, his body tightened in caution. He saw the torn dress, the way she held herself against pain, and the unmistakable Apache features that would draw suspicion in this settlement. His first thought was risk. A wounded stranger on his land meant questions, and questions meant attention. For a moment, he considered turning his back, pretending not to see. But then her face lifted, and recognition struck him. It was her, Nayeli, the girl who used to sit by his family's cook fire and share berries she gathered from the creek bed. The one he had thought about sometimes in the quiet, when wondering how many people were left from those camps that had been broken apart. She wasn't a memory anymore. She was standing here, flesh and blood, scarred but unbroken. Nayeli saw the hesitation in his eyes, and fear touched her stomach. If he rejected her now, there was nowhere else to go. She steadied her voice, pushed down the tremor that wanted to rise, and said quietly but firmly, "Don't you recognize me, Cowboy? I'm your childhood love," said the Apache beauty. Elias's jaw tightened. The words cut past years of silence and drift. He felt the sting of guilt at how easily he could have turned away a woman who once meant something to him. For a moment, he wrestled with doubt about the town, about the trouble her presence could bring, about whether he was strong enough to carry someone else's weight again. Then he set the board down, pulled the nail from his teeth, and crossed to the gate. He didn't speak a welcome, didn't promise anything. Instead, he pushed the gate open, stepped aside, and gestured toward the stoop where a bucket of water stood in the shade. His voice was flat but steady. "Sit." Nayeli crossed into the yard, her knees threatening to buckle with relief. For the first time in weeks, she felt a small shift inside. Fear wasn't gone, but she wasn't alone anymore. Nayeli lowered herself onto the stoop slowly, careful not to let the torn cloth pull at her ribs. The bucket of water stood in front of her, sunlight glinting on the tin ladle, and she reached for it with hands that trembled more from weakness than fear. The first swallow burned her throat, but she kept drinking until her chest eased. Elias stood a few paces away, hammer still in his hand, silent and watchful. His thoughts pressed on him. This was no longer a memory at his gate. This was flesh and blood, and her presence meant trouble with the town. Yet he couldn't send her back out into the flats, not when he could see the wound dark against her dress and the raw exhaustion on her face. Inside the house, the air was close and heavy from the stove that had been burning since morning. The room was plain. One table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed pushed against the wall, and shelves with a few jars of beans and dried corn. Elias had built it for himself, never thinking about company. He motioned her in, and she followed, stepping across the threshold with hesitation, knowing how rare it was for someone here to open a door to her. She looked around quickly, registering the bare boards, the tools stacked in the corner, the way everything was kept in order. It spoke of a man who lived alone, who worked hard, and who trusted little. Elias pointed to the table, then set down the plate he had left from his own meal, cornbread, a heel of bacon, beans thickened from the morning. She looked at him, waiting, not wanting to assume. He gave a short nod. Eat. That one word settled her doubt. She took small bites, pacing herself, her eyes dropping to the food as if afraid he might take it back. While she ate, Elias poured water into a basin, set it on the table, and placed a folded cloth beside it. Then he hesitated, realizing what the silence in the room carried. He spoke with a measured tone, his eyes fixed on her wound. You walked far. From where? She chewed slowly, swallowed, then answered. From the river west of here. Weeks. My people scattered after soldiers came. I kept moving east. Her voice was flat, not dramatic, but the words carried the truth of hunger and flight. She added after a pause, I avoided ranchers, avoided dogs, hid when I had to. I thought I would not reach another settlement. Elias felt the weight of her words. He remembered the year her band had been forced out. He remembered his father cursing soldiers and settlers alike for stirring up war, and he remembered the girl who had vanished with the others. Looking at her now, scarred and thin, he felt guilt twist in his chest, because he had stayed silent when the camps were burned, because he had gone on with his life while hers had been torn apart. Nayeli pushed her plate aside after finishing half, careful not to appear greedy. She unknotted the pouch tied under her dress and pulled out a small roll of sinew thread, a bone needle, and a scrap of cloth, her only supplies. She looked at him with a steady gaze. I need to close the wound better. She gestured to her side where the fabric was stiff with blood. Elias didn't answer right away. Part of him wanted to leave the room, to avoid what he might see, but another part refused to turn his back. Without a word, he lifted the lamp, set it closer, and then stood by in case her hands failed. She gritted her teeth as the needle pierced skin, her breathing sharp. The first stitch slipped, and her hand shook. Elias leaned in, holding the lamp steady, the light catching the sweat on her forehead. Take it slow, he said quietly, his voice carrying neither pity nor judgment. She steadied and finished the job, tying the knots with care. By the end, her face was pale, but her hand did not tremble anymore. She tore a strip from her hem and wrapped it firm around her ribs. When it was done, Elias poured hot water from the kettle into a cup and dropped a pinch of willow bark into it, letting it steep. He placed it before her. She touched the cup, then looked at him with the faintest nod, a wordless thanks. The silence stretched, heavy but not hostile. It was the silence of two people who shared a past, but had not yet decided if they could share a present. Nayeli wondered if he would let her stay, or if this was only for the night. She also thought of the town, of eyes that would soon turn toward her. Elias wondered the same, already picturing whispers at the store and the sheriff's watchful gaze. Yet neither spoke the decision aloud. Elias finally took the other chair, sitting across from her, arms resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the floorboards as if answers might be found there. The truth was simple. She had survived weeks alone, but she could not last much longer without help. And he had spent too many years turning away from others. This time, he didn't want to. Outside, the corral gate creaked in the wind. Inside, the stove settled with a pop. Both of them sat in silence, each holding their own doubts, but neither reaching for the door. For now, that was enough. The next morning broke with a pale sky and a faint chill that came before the sun reached the flats. Elias stepped out early, the hammer still tucked in his belt, and checked the fence line while his coffee cooled on the porch rail. He had not slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the way Nayeli had stitched her own wound by lamplight, her face locked in quiet determination. It was a sight that carried respect, but also unease, because he knew what her presence would stir in town once word spread. Inside, she had woken before dawn, sweeping the floor with a makeshift broom, moving carefully so her ribs did not pull. It was instinct for her to work, to show she was no burden. She boiled the leftover beans, added a handful of dried herbs from her pouch, and set the pot on the stove so the smell would fill the room. She had learned long ago that people watched not only what you said, but how useful you were. Her mind stayed sharp with worry. She knew this kindness from Elias could end if the town pressed him too hard. Still, she forced herself to act like she belonged, even if only for one day. By mid-morning, the first sign came. The storekeeper's boy, no more than 12, wandered down the road with a sack of feed slung over his shoulder. He slowed when he reached the fence and peered at the stoop, his eyes widening when he saw Nayeli sitting there in the sun. He lingered long enough to memorize her face before sprinting back toward the square. Nayeli saw him go. Her stomach tightened. She had lived long enough near settlements to know how quickly whispers turned to stares and stares turned to trouble. Elias returned to the yard and caught her eyes as she shifted uneasily. He understood without needing words. It started, he said flatly. She only nodded. By noon, two men leaned on the rail outside the saloon, smoking and pointing toward the Carver place. They didn't approach, but their presence was a signal. The sheriff himself rode past an hour later, his horse moving slow, the dust rising in steady puffs beneath its hooves. Sheriff Burke was not a man of quick tempers. He had served in the war, carried scars of his own, and ruled this settlement by patience more than force. Still, his badge carried weight, and when he stopped near the gate, it was clear he wasn't passing by out of chance. "Morning, Elias." The sheriff's tone was even, his eyes resting on the woman by the stoop. Nayeli stood, straight-backed, though her sides still ached. She met his gaze without lowering her head. Elias walked to the fence, resting one hand on the top board. "Sheriff, boy tells me you've got company," Burke said, his reins loose in his hand. "That right? That's right." The sheriff studied Nayeli for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Then he turned his eyes back to Elias. "You know how people here will take it. Doesn't matter if she's hurt or not. They'll be talking, and talk brings heat." Elias kept his voice steady. "She hasn't broken any law." "Didn't say she had." Burke shifted in the saddle, the leather creaking. "But I've got to keep order. If men decide to take it into their own hands, order gets harder to hold." Nayeli listened without flinching. She had lived under suspicion too many times to be surprised. Still, she spoke, her tone quiet but clear. "I came here because I had nowhere else to walk. I asked for food, not war. If that is too much, I'll leave." Elias's jaw tightened. He turned his head toward her. The thought of letting her walk back into the flats burned against every part of him that had chosen silence in the past. He shook his head once, firmly. "You're not leaving." The sheriff watched them both, weighing their words, the lines on his face deepening. Finally, he gave a small nod. "I'll tell folks you're under my eye. That buys time. But don't fool yourself. Eyes will stay on you." He tipped his hat, pulled the reins, and rode on without another word. When the dust of his horse settled, Elias exhaled slowly. He looked at Nayeli, who had not moved from her place by the stoop. For the first time since she arrived, her shoulders sagged slightly. She whispered, not to him but to herself, "It begins the same everywhere." Elias heard it and felt the weight of the choice pressing heavier. He knew the questions people would ask. Why risk your own place for her? Why bring old scars back into town? He also knew the answer that mattered most, that this time he wouldn't look away. That night, He let her sleep on the bed while he took the chair, listening to the creak of the house and the faint murmur of town life carried by the wind. When pain woke her near midnight, he rose without a word, stoked the stove, and warmed a rag for her ribs. She accepted it with a brief glance that carried something unspoken. Trust beginning to form again, fragile but real. By dawn, the two of them had already chosen, though neither said it out loud. She stayed. He kept the door open, and whatever came from town, they would face it together. The sheriff's warning still hung in Elias's mind when the next morning broke. He rose before the sun as he always did, out of habit more than rest, and found Naeli already awake. She had folded the blanket neatly, swept the floor again, and sat by the stove with a small pot simmering. The smell of beans mixed with sage drifted through the room. Elias noticed the way she moved, cautious, measured, holding her side when she thought he wasn't watching. She didn't complain, not once, but the pain was plain to see. Over coffee, Elias weighed his choices. He knew the town's talk would grow, and if she was seen as idle or a burden, the whispers would turn sharper. People here measured worth in work. If Naeli was to stay, she had to be seen as useful, not sheltered. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but low. Fence on the north side's loose. Need a hand with the wire. He left it open, an offer, not a command. Naeli looked at him, reading the meaning beneath the words. He wasn't testing her strength. He was giving her a way to belong, to prove herself. She set the pot aside, tightened the wrap around her ribs, and nodded once. Show me. The two of them walked out into the yard. The boards leaned where cattle had pressed through last season, the ground undercut by wind. Elias carried a shovel and a spool of wire. She carried a hammer. He dug while she held the post upright, her face tightening with the strain but refusing to yield. When the wire slipped, she adjusted her grip without waiting for him to correct her. Elias watched from the corner of his eye. Her hands were quick, practiced. She had worked before, maybe not on a corral, but enough to know the rhythm of labor. By midday, they had reset 2 posts and braced a corner. Sweat clung to their skin, dust rising from the dry ground, but neither spoke much beyond what was needed. Hold it steady. Hand me the nail. Pull tighter. Their silence wasn't empty. It was the kind that builds trust and shared effort. When they paused, Elias asked what had kept her alive these past weeks. It was a question that had lingered in his mind since the night she arrived. Naeli answered plainly, her voice even, prickly pears, creek water, roots when I could find them. I stayed low, avoided trails. If soldiers saw me, I would not be here. She didn't embellish, didn't soften the truth. Elias felt a heaviness in his chest, picturing her alone, carrying wounds without help. He realized then how deliberate her choice had been in coming here. Not desperation alone, but memory. She had remembered the boy who once shared bread and believed he might not turn her away as others would. That afternoon, Naeli insisted on cooking. She took what little they had, cornmeal, beans, a strip of salt pork, and stretched it into something that felt like a meal. She added herbs from her pouch, stirring slowly, the steam rising in the small house. Elias sat at the table, watching. He thought of how long it had been since another person had moved about this space, since he had heard the sound of someone else's hands working at his stove. He had built this place to keep others out, and now it no longer felt empty. When the food was ready, she set his bowl in front of him first. It was a small gesture, but Elias noticed it. Respect. Gratitude. He nodded, not out of politeness, but acknowledgement. They ate without hurry, and for the first time since her arrival, the silence between them carried less weight. Later, when Elias prepared to ride into town for supplies, Naeli asked quietly, "Do you want me to stay inside?" The question revealed her fear that being seen might worsen the talk. Elias considered it carefully. Hiding her would not stop suspicion. He answered plainly, "Stay in the yard. Work if you can. People notice work more than shadows." She gave a faint smile, almost the ghost of the girl he once knew. "Then I will work." At the store, Elias bought flour, salt, and a bolt of coarse cotton. The storekeeper's eyes narrowed, but Elias met his stare without flinching. "She'll need the cloth," Elias said, paying in cash. It was the first time he had spoken of her, as if she belonged. When he returned, Naeli had swept the porch, gathered kindling, and washed the plates. She stood waiting, hands raw from scrubbing, but her chin lifted. Elias handed her the cloth without comment, and she accepted it with quiet dignity. That night, as they sat by the stove, Elias spoke of the land. Backwater's good soil, if worked right. Needs a strong windbreak. Could plant corn there next spring. He didn't know why he said it. Maybe to test the sound of a future spoken aloud. Naeli listened, her eyes steady on him, and then she answered, "Windbreak needs brush set low. I can show you. We did that south of the river." The moment hung between them. It wasn't a promise yet, but it was more than survival. For the first time, the thought of building something together edged into both their minds, though neither said it outright. When the lamps were turned low, Elias took the chair again and left her the bed. She lay awake for a while, listening to his steady breathing, her ribs aching less than before. For the first time in weeks, she felt she could close her eyes without fear of what waited when they opened. And Elias, staring into the dark, realized that his house, once only a refuge for his solitude, no longer felt like a place meant for one. The next morning, the air carried a strange stillness. The sky was pale, but a thin brown haze hovered over the flats, promising trouble. Elias had seen it before, wind building up across open land, ready to drive dust into every crack of wood and mouth of livestock. He set his jaw and began checking the windmill, tightening bolts and bracing the blades so they wouldn't shake loose. Naeli watched from the stoop, her braid pulled tight, the wrap around her ribs hidden beneath the coarse cotton he had brought her from town. She recognized the weight in his movements. This was preparation. When Elias came back to the yard, she asked directly, "What is coming?" He studied her for a moment, then answered without softening it. "Dust storm, strong enough to choke the cattle, blind a man if he's caught outside. We'll need water set close and every latch tight." He paused before adding, "You sure you're up for work?" Her expression was steady. "If I cannot work in a storm, I should not be here." The quiet resolve in her voice left no space for doubt. Together they moved quickly. Elias carried heavy buckets to the corral troughs, while Naeli tied cloths around the tops so the water wouldn't foul with grit. She limped slightly when she bent, but she forced herself through it. When the windmill creaked under the first push of air, Elias looked up at the sky, then back at her. "Inside soon, but first the boards on the west side. Help me hold them." They nailed 2 loose planks over the gaps where dust could drive in. The hammer jarred her ribs each time she steadied the board, but she held firm. Sweat traced across her temple, and Elias noticed, ready to take over, but she refused with a shake of her head. He saw then that she wasn't proving herself to him anymore. She was proving to herself that she could still endure. By midday, the wind arrived full, sharp with grit. The air turned brown, swallowing the view beyond the yard. Dust pressed under the doorframe, sifted through every seam in the wall. Inside, Elias pushed cloth into the cracks while Naeli dampened rags and laid them across the sill. Their world shrank to the space of that single room, the howl outside louder than any voice. They worked side by side until there was nothing left to do but wait. Sitting at the table, they ate what was left from the pot she had cooked that morning. Each spoonful carried grit despite their efforts, and the air stung their throats. Naeli coughed once, pressed the rag against her mouth, and looked at him. "How long?" she asked. "Could be hours. Could be days," Elias answered. His voice was calm, but his eyes flicked to the door each time it rattled. Naeli studied him, the set of his shoulders, the way he kept himself steady even as the storm pressed harder. She thought back to the boy she had once known by the creek, quick to laugh, restless, and saw how different this man was now. He was worn, slower to speak, but in that silence was a kind of strength she hadn't expected. Elias, in turn, found himself glancing at her more than he admitted. She was thin, tired, and wounded, yet she sat upright, refusing to show fear. He thought about the risk she had taken in coming here, about the way she had stitched her own skin without complaint, about the way she now sat waiting out a storm as if she had always belonged in this house. It stirred something he hadn't let himself feel in years, respect that could turn into trust. When night came, the wind showed no mercy. Dust seeped into their blankets, coated the floor, settled in their hair. Elias rose often to check the stove and the door, while Naeli kept dampening cloths and pressing them against the gaps. They didn't speak much, but when their eyes met in the lamplight, both understood what the other was holding back. Fear, yes, but also the decision to endure together rather than alone. By dawn, the storm broke. The wind dropped, leaving the land hushed and colorless under a dim sun. The yard looked half-buried, fence posts leaning under drifts of grit. Elias opened the door, blinking against the brightness, and stepped outside. Naeli followed, pulling her shawl close, and together they surveyed the damage. It was bad, but not ruin. The cattle still stood, the troughs still held water, the windmill still turned. Naeli exhaled, the first breath she had taken in hours that wasn't laced with grit. She looked at Elias and said, "It could have taken us." It did not. Elias met her gaze, and for the first time since she had arrived, a faint trace of relief touched his face. No, it didn't. They spent the day digging out the fence line, clearing the yard, and setting things right. The storm had tested them both, and neither had broken. By the time the sun fell again, the land was still harsh, but the bond between them had grown clearer. They had endured the storm side by side, and in the west, that was no small thing. The storm left behind a silence that felt heavier than the wind itself. For 2 days, Elias and Naeli worked to clear the drifts of grit that had piled against the fences and pressed under the door. Their hands were raw, their clothes ground stiff with dust, but the work gave rhythm to the hours. By the third morning, the land looked steady again, scarred but livable. Elias thought maybe the worst had passed. He was wrong. Late that morning, 2 riders came down the north road. Their horses moved slow but sure, the kind of mounts hardened by long miles. Both men wore dusters that had seen too much travel, their hats low, their eyes sharp. They didn't look like drifters or townsmen. They looked like men who followed sign and got paid to bring people in. Elias knew the type. He set down the shovel and leaned against the fence, his rifle within reach though not in his hands. The riders stopped at the gate. The taller one spoke first, his voice carrying across the yard. "We're looking for an Apache woman. Came through these parts after a skirmish near the river. Heard she might have made it this far." Elias kept his expression flat. "Plenty of travelers pass through. I don't keep count." The second rider's gaze slid past him toward the house. Naeli stood in the doorway, her shawl drawn close, her face steady but pale. She didn't step back, didn't hide, but the tension in her jaw showed she knew exactly what they were. The taller man pointed with his chin. "That her?" Before Elias could answer, another voice broke the standoff. Sheriff Burke rode up slow from the ridge, his horse blowing dust from its nostrils. He had seen the riders long before they reached the gate. He stopped his horse alongside, one hand resting easy on the reins. "Morning, gentlemen. You here on county business?" The taller rider shifted in his saddle, annoyed at the interruption. "Private business. There's bounty notices in Prescott. Apache girl fits this one's look. We'll take her and be gone." Burke's tone stayed calm but firm. "Not without papers signed in this county, you won't. I've seen no warrants, no legal claim. If you've got something official, let's ride to my office and check the books." The second rider scowled. "Since when does a sheriff protect savages?" Burke's eyes narrowed, though his voice never rose. "Since it's my job to keep law, not let men snatch folks off porches on rumor. You got a name?" Naeli spoke then, her voice even though her hands clenched at her sides. "Naeli, daughter of Taza. My band was scattered weeks ago. I have broken no law here." She said it not as a plea, but as fact. The taller rider spat into the dust. "No law maybe, but plenty of reason." He looked to Elias, measuring him. "You hiding her, cowboy? That your game?" Elias felt every part of the moment press down on him. He could step aside, say she wasn't his concern, and the men would drag her away. It would end the risk, and the stares, and the whispers in town. His life could go back to quiet. But he remembered the way she stitched her wound by lamplight, The way she stood in the storm without complaint, the way she had looked at him that first night and asked if he remembered. He knew his answer before he spoke. "She's under my roof," Elias said, his voice steady as iron. "That makes her my concern." The riders shifted in their saddles, hands brushing close to their belts. The sheriff eased his horse a step forward, his revolver low at his side, though not raised. "You heard the man. No papers, no warrant. You want to test that? You test me first." For a long moment, the only sound was the windmill creaking behind the house. Then the taller rider cursed under his breath, jerked his reins, and turned his horse. The second followed, their silhouettes shrinking against the horizon. Burke watched until they were gone, then turned his eyes back on Elias. "You just made yourself part of this, Carver. They'll be back, or others will. You still sure?" Elias met his gaze without flinching. "I'm sure." The sheriff gave a short nod, adjusted his hat, and rode off toward town. When the dust settled again, Elias turned to see Nayeli still standing in the doorway. Her face was calm, but her eyes carried something deeper, fear mixed with a gratitude too strong to put into words. For the first time, she stepped fully out onto the stoop, closing the distance between them. "You didn't have to," she said quietly. "Yes," Elias answered. "I did." In that simple exchange, the line was crossed. From that day, her presence in his house was no longer temporary. She belonged, and he had made it clear he would stand against whoever came to say otherwise. For a few days after the riders left, the settlement stayed quiet. Elias and Nayeli went about their work, careful but steady, repairing what the storm had broken, hauling water, and tending to the small patch of ground where Elias hoped to plant come spring. The sheriff did not return, and neither did the bounty men. Yet both Elias and Nayeli knew the silence wasn't trust, it was waiting. People were watching, measuring how long he would keep her under his roof. On the fourth morning, a cry cut through the stillness of town. It carried across the square, high and sharp, the sound of a mother's fear. Elias was fixing a gate hinge when he heard it. He dropped the hammer and looked up. Nayeli, standing nearby with a pail of water, had already stiffened. She knew that cry too well. Without waiting for him, she set the bucket down and began walking fast toward the road that led into town. Elias cursed under his breath and went after her. By the time they reached the well behind the church, a crowd had gathered. Dust kicked up under shifting boots as voices shouted over one another. A boy, maybe 6 or 7, had slipped through the rotten cover and fallen down into the shaft. His mother was on her knees, clawing at the stones, her sobs breaking the air. The pastor was shouting for planks, but none had come. The rope coiled nearby was too short to reach the bottom. Nayeli didn't hesitate. She pushed through the circle of people, ignoring the glares, and dropped to her stomach at the edge of the well. Her voice cut clean through the noise. "Bring me rope. Strong rope." The men nearest her hesitated, glancing at each other, unsettled by the sight of her taking charge. Elias arrived, pushing his way through, his face hard as stone. "Do as she says," he barked, his tone leaving no room for doubt. A length of rope was dragged forward. Elias tied it around Nayeli's waist, pulling the knot tight, his hands rough but steady. "You sure?" he asked, low so only she could hear. She met his eyes. "I've hauled water from pits deeper than this. I can do it." Without waiting for approval, she slid down into the darkness, the rope squealing against the stones as Elias braced himself at the wellhead, boots dug in, muscles straining. The air below was damp and narrow, the walls scraping her shoulders as she lowered herself down. She reached the boy, who clung to a jagged stone ledge, his small arms trembling. His face was pale with fear, but he was still breathing. "Hold me," Nayeli whispered to him, steadying his arms around her neck. "Do not let go." Above, Elias shouted, "Pull." The crowd surged forward, helping him heave the rope up. The strain bit into his hands, but he didn't let go. Slowly, inch by inch, Nayeli and the boy rose into the light. Her ribs screamed with pain, but she held on until his head cleared the stones. The pastor grabbed the child and pulled him onto solid ground, the mother collapsing around him with cries of relief. The crowd went silent for a long moment, watching as Elias hauled Nayeli the rest of the way up. She dragged herself over the edge, coughing from the damp air, her hands raw from gripping the rope. She sat back on the dirt, chest heaving, eyes closed. The silence broke not with whispers this time, but with a murmur that carried something different, uncertainty, maybe even respect. The storekeeper's wife stepped forward, pressed a hand to Nayeli's shoulder, and said softly, "You saved him." Others shifted uneasily, their hard opinions dented by what they had just witnessed. Sheriff Burke arrived moments later, his horse lathered from the ride. He took in the scene quickly, the boy alive in his mother's arms, the Apache woman sitting pale and exhausted, Elias standing guard beside her. He tipped his hat, his eyes meeting Elias's, and for the first time there was no warning in them, only acknowledgement. That evening, back at the house, Nayeli sat on the stoop, her ribs wrapped again, her body aching, but her spirit steady. Elias handed her a cup of water and settled beside her. For a while they said nothing, listening to the windmill creak and the faint murmur of town life in the distance. Finally, Nayeli spoke. "Everywhere I go, I am watched. Today they watched me differently." Elias nodded, his gaze on the horizon. "You show them who you are. That'll be harder for them to forget than the talk." She looked at him then, her eyes tired but firm. "You pull me out too. Without you, I would still be in the dark." Elias shook his head slightly. "Without you, that boy would still be." The silence that followed was not heavy this time. It was the kind of silence that came after something had been proven. For the first time since she arrived, Nayeli felt the ground under her feet belonged to her as much as it did to him. The day after the well rescue, the air in the settlement felt different. It wasn't warm or welcoming, not yet, but the sharp edge of suspicion had dulled. At the store, when Elias went for flour and nails, the storekeeper's wife quietly set a small sack of coffee on the counter and said it was for thanks. The storekeeper didn't argue, only cleared his throat and wrote the purchase down without comment. Elias noticed the shift, subtle but there. People were beginning to see Nayeli not just as a reminder of old scars, but as someone who had saved a child when no one else could. Nayeli sensed it too. When she walked into town with Elias later that week to help carry supplies, no one spat at her feet or turned their back outright. There were stares, yes, but some were longer looks of curiosity rather than hatred. A woman at the well even nodded once in her direction. For Nayeli, it was not acceptance, but it was survival made easier. She knew such moments could turn back with one rumor, but for now she took the change as something earned. Back at the homestead, Elias began speaking more of the land's future. He had always thought of it as his place to retreat, not to grow, but with Nayeli's presence the silence felt less like emptiness and more like room to build. He pointed to the back quarter, where the soil was darker near the ridge. "If we set a windbreak here, it'll hold enough moisture for a row of corn. Maybe beans too." Nayeli studied the ground and nodded. "Brush should be stacked low to keep the sand from running under. South of the river, my people did it with mesquite and yucca." She crouched and drew a line in the dirt with her finger, showing where the rows could run. Elias knelt beside her, listening more closely than he had listened to anyone in years. That night, Sheriff Burke rode out to the house. He carried a packet of papers, folded and sealed from the county seat. Sitting his horse by the fence, he handed them down to Elias. "Homestead claim. Back quarters still open. If you file in both names, it gives her legal standing. Means no drifter or bounty man can claim she has no right to be here if you're gone." Elias read the paper by lantern light while Nayeli stood silent beside him. The sheriff watched, saying nothing more, then tipped his hat and rode back to town. Elias folded the papers carefully and set them on the table. He looked at Nayeli. "Saturday we'll ride in. We'll file it together." She searched his face, as if to see if he meant it. "You would give my name to the county? On your land?" "It's our land if you choose it," Elias said simply. There was no flourish, no soft words. Just a plain truth spoken steady. The days leading up to Saturday were filled with work that felt different, less like patching and more like shaping. They repaired the corral posts that leaned worst after the storm. Nayeli gathered wild herbs from the edge of the flats and showed Elias how to dry them for medicine. She also patched Elias's shirt with the bolt of coarse cotton he had bought for her, the stitches neat and strong. When he slipped it on, he felt the weight of her care in every line of thread. Elias began leaving the rifle on its hooks near the door instead of carrying it into the yard. He realized he trusted the space again, trusted that with Nayeli there, the house no longer needed defending in the same way. She, in turn, began walking the farther edge of the fence alone, testing her ribs and her strength, claiming the ground with every step. One evening they sat by the corral, watching the cattle press against the fence in the cool air. Elias broke the silence first. "When we were children, you gave me a piece of dried meat from your camp. I remember because it was the first time I tasted anything smoked that way. My father didn't approve, but I didn't care." Nayeli smiled faintly, the first true smile since she arrived. "I remember. You traded me your bread. It was soft. I had never had bread like that before." For a while they sat, remembering without speaking further. The bond between them was no longer only survival, but the faint shaping of something deeper, shared memory tied to new work. On Saturday, they rode into the county seat together. Elias handled the papers with care, signing his name with a hand that barely trembled. Nayeli pressed her name beside his, the letters careful, as if each stroke carried weight she had never been allowed to hold before. The clerk stamped them and slid the papers back across the desk. The sheriff signed as witness. It was done. On the ride back, Nayeli carried the folded deed in her pouch. She touched it more than once, not to check if it was still there, but to remind herself it was real. For the first time since the night she had fled the river, she felt the ground beneath her might hold her weight. That evening, as they ate cornbread and beans by lamplight, the air between them carried a new steadiness. Elias didn't speak of promises, and Nayeli didn't ask for them. They both understood that the papers meant more than words could. She wasn't a guest anymore. She belonged. The deed lay folded in Nayeli's pouch, its edges softening from how often she checked it. And though no one said it aloud, both she and Elias knew that piece of paper changed everything. But a claim on land didn't erase the eyes of men who had already decided who she was. By the week's end, trouble came riding slow out of the North Road. It was near sundown when 3 men appeared at the fence line. They weren't strangers to Elias. He'd seen them often enough leaning against the saloon rail, the kind who drank more than they worked and stirred talk when they could. Tonight, they brought more than talk. One carried a half-empty bottle. Another rested his hand too close to the butt of his revolver, and the third spat in the dirt with every step of his horse, as if marking his claim. Nayeli stood in the yard, a basket of kindling in her arms. The moment she saw them, she knew what they were, men looking to prove themselves at someone else's cost. She set the basket down, her shoulders stiff, and walked toward the porch where Elias had just stepped out. He carried no rifle, only his worn revolver at his side, but his posture was enough. The leader, a broad man with a scar across his cheek, spoke first. "Evening, Carver. Looks like you've made yourself a new arrangement out here." His tone was mocking, loud enough for the others to hear. Paper or no paper, folks don't take kindly to an Apache woman playing homesteader. Elias leaned against the post, his arms loose at his sides. His voice was flat. "You've had your say. Now ride on." The second man laughed, a sharp sound that carried in the dry air. "We're not here for talk. We're here to remind you the town don't want her. You turn her out, we're done. You keep her, then you're choosing sides you can't hold." His hand brushed his revolver again, slow, letting the weight of the gesture hang. Nayeli moved closer to the porch, her hand steady on the gate latch. Her ribs still ached some days, but she didn't falter. If they rushed the yard, she'd hold the gate until Elias fired. Her mind raced, not in fear of dying, but in fear of being dragged back into a life of running when she had only just found solid ground. The standoff might have broken bloody if not for the voice that came from the elm beyond the fence. "That's far enough." Sheriff Burke stepped into sight, his revolver already in hand, barrel low but unmistakably ready. He had been watching since dusk, following a hunch that men like these wouldn't let silence last too long. The scar man turned his horse halfway, sneering. "Sheriff, This ain't your fight. Burke's jaw tightened. It's the county's fight if you draw on a man at his own fence. You want to push it? Then I'll bury the first one who does. His tone left no doubt. The men hesitated. The scarred leader spat again, but the sound carried less conviction now. This ain't over, Carver. You'll wish you'd thought harder. With that, he yanked his reins, and the three horses turned back up the road, their curses fading into the dusk. The yard fell quiet. Elias lowered his hand from his revolver, but his eyes stayed on the road long after the riders disappeared. The sheriff holstered his weapon and looked at him square. You've made your choice clear. Don't expect it to get easier. Elias gave a short nod. Didn't ask for easy. Burke tipped his hat toward Naeli. You held steady. Then he turned and rode off, leaving them alone with the cooling air. Inside, when the lamps were lit, Elias sat at the table, silent as he cleaned the revolver. Naeli laid her hand over his for the first time since she'd arrived. Not for comfort, not for thanks, but as a mark of standing with him in the choice he had just confirmed in front of the whole county. He looked at her hand, calloused but steady, then at her face. No words were spoken, but in that silence both of them understood. They were no longer surviving side by side. They were bound together now, in name, in land, and in defiance of anyone who tried to break them apart. That night, Elias left the rifle on the hooks by the door again, but this time it wasn't about trust in the quiet. It was because he knew if the men came back, they would face them together, and he no longer felt the weight of being the only one to stand. The night after the confrontation, the house stayed quiet, but neither Elias nor Naeli slept deeply. Both listened for hoofbeats, for shouts, for the sound of men deciding to finish what they had started. None came. When dawn broke, the yard was still, the corral intact, the land spread wide and empty except for the low call of cattle. The threat had passed for now, but both knew the real test was whether the settlement would keep pressing or finally leave them be. In the following days, something shifted in town. The riders who had threatened Elias didn't return. Word spread that the sheriff himself had backed Carver at his gate, revolver in hand. Men who liked to stir trouble measured that against the well rescue, against the fact that Elias had filed the deed in both names, and they began to find less taste for talk they couldn't back with action. Suspicion remained, but open challenge eased. Folks turned their words back to weather, cattle prices, and supply wagons. Elias noticed the change when he went to the store. The storekeeper no longer narrowed his eyes, but weighed out flour in silence. His wife even asked if Naeli wanted more of the herd she had brought last week. Elias didn't mistake it for welcome, but it was enough. No stares sharper than usual, no whispers that stopped the moment he stepped inside. At the homestead, life began to settle into a rhythm that felt less like borrowed time. Naeli planted along the windbreak, setting brush low just as she had described. Elias worked the back quarter with the plow, the soil rough but turning under his hands. Together they hauled water, patched posts, and shared meals cooked from what little they had. It was not abundance, but it was theirs. One Sunday afternoon, Pastor Green rode out. He carried a Bible tucked in his coat and a small sheet of paper folded inside. He had spoken with Sheriff Burke and the clerk, and he asked a simple question. Do you want her claim filed as marriage as well as homestead? Elias looked at Naeli. She held his eyes steady. No fear, no hesitation. She said one word, yes. The pastor stood them in the yard, the windmill creaking behind, the corral fence stretching wide. Sheriff Burke and the storekeeper's wife serve as witnesses, their faces solemn but respectful. The pastor read the vows plain and short. Elias and Naeli signed their names on the page. There were no rings, no music, no long speeches, just a stamped record and two signatures that bound what was already true. Afterward, they ate a simple meal together, cornbread, beans, and the coffee the storekeeper's wife had sent. When the witnesses rode back to town, Elias and Naeli sat in the fading light on the stoop, listening to the evening settle across the land. For the first time, neither of them carried the tension of wondering if tomorrow would bring a knock at the door or a demand at the gate. As the weeks turned to summer, the land answered their work. Corn sprouted along the ridge, beans twisted up the poles Naeli had set, and the windbreak began to hold the soil. The cattle filled out, the trough stayed clean, and the house took on the look of a place lived in by two, not one. Elias noticed how her shawl now hung beside his hat on the peg, how two pairs of boots stood by the door. The emptiness that had once defined the house was gone. One evening, as they stood by the corral, Elias said quietly, "When you came that first day, I almost didn't open the gate." Naeli looked at him, her face calm, her eyes softer now than when she had first arrived. "And yet you did." He gave a short nod. "I won't close it again." She placed her hand in his, not as thanks, not as reassurance, but as a simple act of belonging. The silence between them carried no fear, no uncertainty, only the weight of a life chosen and shared. The town never became warm, but it became fair enough. No more riders came hunting. No more whispers carried the threat of violence. The well behind the church had a new cover, solid and chained. The sheriff kept his quiet watch, and life pressed forward in steady work. Elias and Naeli's bond did not rest on promises of forever or on words dressed in sentiment. It stood in the way they stayed when leaving would have been easier, in the water set on the stoop, in the rope tied, right at the well, in the deed signed with both names. What began as survival turned into permanence, and the land, once a place of silence and dust, grew into their home. By the end of that summer, with corn high along the windbreak and the sound of cattle low in the dusk, their story had no question marks left. They had faced the storm, the riders, the town, and each other. They had chosen to remain. And in the West, that was love enough.